I'm delighted all of you to this evening's Richard C. Holbrooke lecture entitled Europe in an Age of Economic Warfare. I'm honored to welcome you all and do the big job of introducing the introducer. But before that, I'd also like to say a few words about the Richard C. Holbrooke Fellowship before relinquishing the mic. The fellowship was started as a Richard C. Holbrooke Forum in 2013 to honor the Academy's founder, Richard C. Holbrooke, and his lifelong commitment to applying the tools of diplomacy and statecraft to solving some of the world's most intractable problems. And for those of you who are currently watching The Diplomat on Netflix, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The program aimed and still aims to bring together some of the most influential thinkers and practitioners in global affairs to engage in frank, dynamic, meaningful discussions about pressing contemporary issues in the international community. In 2018, the forum was enhanced to include the fellowship, which is a semester-long residency here at the Academy, and it includes a workshop. And I'm very happy to see some of our past March workshop participants here tonight. But I'm even more happy to have Abraham Newman as the Spring 2023 Richard C. Holbrooke Fellow. I will let our introducer tell you more about Abe, and then he has all night to tell you about his project, which I think you'll find fascinating. I would now like to welcome Professor Cornelia Woll, who will introduce Abe Newman and also then join him on stage for a discussion. Cornelia Woll is president of the Hertie School and professor of international political economy. She came to the Hertie School in 2022 from Sciences Po in Paris, where we almost intersected briefly by a few days. At Sciences Po, she served in many roles since 2006, including president of the academic board, professor of political science, and co-director of the Max Planck Sciences Po Center. She's been a visiting professor at Goethe University Frankfurt and Harvard University. She's many degrees, but my personal favorite are her MA and BA in International Relations and Political Science from the University of Chicago, my alma mater. Her research focuses on international political economy and economic sociology, and in particular, regulatory issues in the European Union and the United States. Not only is it her expertise that makes her the perfect discussant this evening, but also her many years of friendship with our guest of honor tonight. So it's really extra special to have you here with us. Cornelia Woll will come up now to introduce Abe, after which Abe will speak for about 30 minutes, and then the two of them will have a discussion here on stage. And after that, we'll have a Q&A session. For those of you in the room, please do raise your hands at that time. And looking at some of you, I'm sure there's going to be some amazing questions. And then if you're joining us on Zoom, please do type your questions into the Q&A chat and don't raise your hand because we won't see it, sadly. And now I'd like to give the floor to Professor Woll.
Thank you very much, Anna, for the nice introduction, and thank you very much to the American Academy for hosting this lovely event and for choosing your Richard C. Holbrooke Fellow so well. My name is Cornelia Woll, and I'm very pleased to present Professor Newman, we're in German, Germany today. Dear Abe, ladies and gentlemen. When the American Academy in Berlin approached me to introduce Abe's lecture, I was more than happy to say a few words. Abe and I first met in the early 2000s, over 20 years ago, I would say, when we were both doing doctoral research and were invited at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies in Cologne. At the time, Abe was completing his PhD at Berkeley, and we shared an interest in international relations, in trade, in network industry. But I was struck, because we really did very similar things, by how deeply he was passionate about the internet. And that seemed to me a very West Coast thing, because in the early 2000s, that was just a geeky topic that only people who like technology were into. And I just, for the life of me, couldn't see the regulatory and governance issues, tells you my visionary focus, while Abe was already working on it and continued to be working on what today is a central structure of data networks and our economy. Since that time, I had the pleasure of staying in touch with Abe and following his extraordinary career. In 2006, he became a professor of government at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service in the government department at Georgetown University after finishing his PhD at the University of California, Berkeley. In the fall of last year, we were lucky to host him as a fellow at our Center for International Security before he took up the mantle of the Richard C. Holbrooke Fellowship here at the American Academy during his year in Berlin. Abe is a very prolific scholar of political economy, writing on a host of topics from global regulatory regimes to data privacy. But over time, if you look intensively at the different topics he dealt with, he really moved with big determination, but slowly from what is a regulatory issue, data privacy in particular, to what is the real challenge for power and abuse of power in the global economy. And you see this from his original book, Protectors of Privacy, Regulating Personal Data in the Global Economy, that he published in 2008, to the books that he had co-written, first with Elliot Posner, Voluntary Disruptions, International Soft Law, Finance and Power in 2018, to a book published with Henry Farrell in 2019 of Privacy and Power, the Transatlantic Struggle over Freedom and Security, which won numerous awards. At the same time and through this work, and with the same partner in crime, Henry Farrell, he outlined what would become his major and much-cited contribution to the study of international security. In a groundbreaking article published in the journal International Security in 2019, they explored how asymmetrical interdependent economic networks have given certain states the opportunity to coerce others in a way that he referred to as weaponized interdependence. And I will admit, when I first heard this term, I thought it was awful. Again, little did I know what it would become. It is this most recent work on economic warfare and state coercion that brings us here today. The piece that I just told you about has received rave reviews in the academic community alike at the time, earning the ISA's 2020 Best Security Studies Article Award. The work has influenced the research of countless other scholars, including myself, and has since become a foundational concept in the discussion of global markets and security. But Fletcher School professor Dan Dresner perhaps put it best when he succinctly wrote, "I have worked on the questions of economic statecraft for more than 20 years and was absolutely furious that they had observed bits and pieces of this idea floating in the scholarly ether, thought about it rigorously, and made it so darn clear and compelling for everyone else." I will say that Dan has also co-authored with you on putting some of this into shape, but it is a very good summary. And what is more, Abe and Henry Farrell continue to work tirelessly to make their insights available to a broader public. The original idea about weaponized interdependence will soon be published. I have written here in an accessible book detailing the mechanisms of American power and security interests through an analysis of US economic networks with what is my favorite title, The Underground Empire. But it is not a forthcoming book. It's a book that's sitting on this table, so I will walk over and wave it just because I mentioned it. If you buy just one book this year, let it be Underground Empire. Now, in the nearly 4 years since the original article was published, we've seen how true their keen observation was. During the cold Berlin winter, we have all experienced firsthand Russia's attempts to degrade Europe's support for Ukraine by cutting off its gas deliveries. Europe has similar weak points in its dependency on China and in technologies like the 5G network and other networks that we now very clearly see the potential for weaponization. The impact of Abe's work has made its way outside the halls of the ivory tower into popular media and policymaking. At the Hertie School, where we train future leaders to connect innovative policy ideas with rigorous scientific practice, to put all of this into the service of society, he's been able to present it, and he's been a prime example that some of our students admire and have talked to me after one of the presentations you've given. For example, the journalist Ezra Klein has discussed the weaponized interdependence with guests on his New York Times podcast. In October of last year, European Commission Vice President Margrethe Vestager told EU heads of delegation that we have had a hard awakening into the era of weaponized interdependence, as she advocated for rethinking Europe's openness and economic dependence on other countries. Bringing science into the public debate is more important than ever, and I can't think of a better example than Abe's work in doing exactly that. Which brings us to the topic of Abe's lecture today. Europe finds itself in a period of great transition as it navigates the overlapping crises that endanger systems and networks that we once thought were rock solid and neutral. These vulnerabilities can be exploited by Europe's adversaries, leaving the bloc with the crucial questions of what it can do to mitigate these risks, to de-risk, as one says today, rather than decouple. And I can think of no better scholar to provide insights for this important discussion. So without further ado, let's dive into Abe's lecture on this critical subject. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Cornelia. It was a very sweet and touching introduction. She does not get paid for the plug of the book, just so you know. There's no money was changed hands. I also want to thank the Academy and Anna for hosting me and my family here this year. We have had an amazing time intellectually, spiritually, just having a chance to recover from COVID. I can't tell you how amazing it has been to be in this space. And I also, in that way, want to thank the other fellows who are here tonight, who we've been, sitting at these tables, having these dinners, having conversations on such a broad range of topics. I also want to thank the staff here, who is unbelievable, and they really make everything happen. And the final shout out I want to give is to, I have a set of friends here tonight who I met over 20 years ago, who have been nurturing me in my life in Germany ever since then. And I'm just grateful that they're here and have supported me over the years. Okay. Now, with all that, work, as Cornelia would say. So this talk is going to have, it's either a tragedy or a comedy, depending on what you think, in 3 parts. Because, I teach at a Jesuit university, so the trinities are very important in these places. And I think people really can't hold much more than 3 things in their mind at one time. So you have 3 parts. And the reason it's a tragedy or comedy is that the 3 parts will be a myth that I want to challenge, a warning that I want you to listen to, and then some hope. And the question is, does the warning kind of trump the hope, or does the hope trump the warning? And it'll either be a comedy or a tragedy for you, depending on where you fall out in this conversation. So let me just start with what's the myth about, and where do we need to rethink it? Well, it's all about these global economic networks that have transformed our lives. They might be, they're somewhere in your pocket. It could be your phone that is allowing you to talk to people across the world. It's probably your phone that's also letting you make some kind of financial transaction. I use Wise. I'm not being paid by Wise, but it's amazing. I can give money to people in the United States by just flipping my finger. Or it's maybe about production. It's about a system where a company in Taiwan makes the most advanced semiconductors in the world, and we all depend on it. So this is new. This didn't exist in 1930, in 1960. You could not move any of that money on Wise until after capital controls were gone. So, that's like through the 1970s, 1980s. You couldn't make any of those calls. I was here in the 1990s with my friends. I had some card. You had to punch in a number on a card to call my parents. It was very expensive. The production systems, these production systems were national. So something happened. It started in the 1970s as finance started to loosen up. There are the revolution in telecommunications, revolutions in production, but really they come to the head in the 1990s, and it's what we think of today as we call globalization. These networks of information, money, and production that are not just national. It's not a German bank, it's a global bank. It's not just a U.S. telecommunications company, it's a global company. And they are working with partners across the globe. And so how do we understand this transformation? What should we make of it? And there's a story that was told, which is most famous. It's somewhere in your head. Even if you think it's a stupid story, it's locked in there somewhere. And it was told most clearly by Thomas Friedman. He had this book, A World is Flat. He had an article in 1999. It was kind of after the end of the Cold War, where he said, we're living in a world of a web, not a wall. He's talking about the Berlin Wall. The Cold War is over, and now we've entered this new webbed world, which he was playing off of the World Wide Web. It's kind of one of those, that's Cornelia's geeky early terms for the internet, But in this world, as the myth goes, the power was decentralized. So it wasn't going to be a world of states like the Cold War. the Soviets and the US. It wasn't going to be a world where just a few people were going to be in power. It was a world where all that power was going to be distributed. And what was going to trump everything else was economic issues, exchange, finance, firms. They were going to be in control. You know, he had that kind of whole story about the Lexus and the olive branch, and there was going to be companies where we're going to basically make states, they were going to be neutered by these global firms that were going to run the show. And they were going to do it in these very decentralized network structures of the web. And this story, even though maybe some people were like, it seems kind of simplistic, they fed into a set of long-standing narratives that were driving policymakers to make decisions, not just firms to make decisions. And so if you think about this list of stories, the four freedoms, it's the bedrock of the European Union. It's the whole idea that what's the purpose of the European Union? It's to open markets. It's to create these markets that the web is built on. Wandel durch Handel. This, even today, is still, I think, in the German kind of mindset of like, this is how we think of our foreign economic policy, which is the idea that we will change the world through trade, through openness, through expanding these markets. And there, it was even the kind of the way the transatlantic relationship was framed was we will, Marshall Plan, all that stuff, will buy and sell things from each other, and the world will be better for it. And it was all based, you've heard this story a lot of times about win-wins. Ricardo, the idea that if we just trade and we exchange goods, there'll be more stuff in the world and we'll be better for it. And the corollary was, as Friedman said, we won't go to war anymore. We'll be peaceful with each other. So I think that this myth, I'm calling it a myth, kind of in the German version of myth. It's a mythos. It's a story. It's a simple story that drives our understanding of how we act both as companies, as individuals, as policymakers, that it has really faced a reckoning. And I'm just gonna, I don't even need to go through all these things, but it's not working anymore, okay? It doesn't tell us the story we need to make sense of how things are happening. Not planned. Ludwig has a story up here, but it was not planned. So whether it is, Trump and the trade wars, if it's about tech wars between the US and China, even other countries, so Japan and South Korea had this fight over semiconductor chemicals. All of these tell us a story where trade is becoming a vulnerability. It's not just a source of wealth and security. And you don't really need to go beyond COVID, with you couldn't get toilet paper to realize that something is not right in the land of Ricardo. It wasn't delivering all of the things we needed. And so what I'm going to tell you is a different simple story. It's not that complicated, but it's of a different world, a way to think about the world of those networks for information, finance, and production, that I think gives some leverage to understand what should we as citizens, as policymakers, as businesses, how should we prepare ourselves for this world? So I'm just going to really quickly run you through, Vestager's era of weaponized interdependence, which is always a little weird when some policymaker is using your term as an era, but I'm sticking with it. I think it's a good idea. So what is the basic argument? I'm going to tell it to you very quickly. Then I'm going to go through its parts, and that's going to be this myth part of the presentation. So the first point is simple, is just many of the most important economic networks in the world, they're centralized. You only have to name a few companies, Apple, JP Morgan, TSMC, to know that we are not in that decentralized web. We are in something very different, where a few firms are disproportionately powerful in the global economy. And that's for private reasons. They solved problems that people liked, or they made a lot of money and bought up other companies so nobody else could do it. But either way, these firms are centralized. These economic networks are centralized. The second point is just to say governments, especially the most powerful governments, have realized this. And they are using those central nodes in the global economy to coerce their adversaries, to get back at their other states, at their enemies. And I think it's critical for policymakers in Europe to wrap their heads around this if we're going to have a peaceful economy going forward. Okay, so that's the simple story that I'm going to, as opposed to Frieden's, and I want to give you now kind of a little bit more about each point. So the first is a map that you may or may not recognize. If it was Frankfurt, you would probably see it immediately. But this is the Delta map in the United States. If you fly Delta and you want to go from Caracas to Cancun, you're going to go through Atlanta. And that doesn't make any sense. But it makes sense for Delta because it creates control over their system. It also creates efficiencies. They can park all their people. They can have them all sleep there in Atlanta. They do things for many different reasons. And the literature on networks gives you a lot of stories. It might be because rich get richer. They learn things, how to optimize their process. It could be because they buy out all the other competitors. For Henry and I, it doesn't matter. All we need to know is that many global economic networks, they take on this structure, this asymmetry. And it's often around what some people call a hub and spoke model. There's a central part of the network, and then it goes out into these different spokes of the network. And that fact is a fundamental challenge to the myth that most people have. It's not decentralized. It's not Etsy world where like somebody it's not that story. It's a story where there are a few firms that have a system, an economic system that concentrates exchange in a few places. So here's the second move, is webs, they often have spiders at the center of them. They are not decentralized. They are actually dangerous places where people get stuck in them and they communicate information to the center. When something goes into that net, the vibrations go back and the spider moves. And what we are arguing is that a few powerful states, they have this power. It's probably the US, China, maybe the EU. I think the EU does, but people will maybe argue with me. And they use this structure of globalization to assert their preferences. And I'm going to tell you two ways that they do that now. The first is something that Henry and we called the panopticon effect. And this is like drawing on Jeremy Bentham. He was a kind of a utopian thinker who had the idea of you could build an amazing prison. This is what utopian thinkers used to think about. It's like you could build an amazing prison if you built a circle and you just built one tower in the center and you would only need one guard and you could see all of the prisoners and their activity. And Foucault, he takes that idea and he translates it to state power. And he says, powerful states get what they want if they can be in this middle position. And he was really thinking about domestics, in our societies. But this works at the global level too. If you have access to Apple's data, then you sit at the middle of the panopticon. You can see everybody's phone, everything that's happening there. If you sit in the middle, there's something called the SWIFT system, which is in Belgium, and it makes all the kind of global financial transactions. You can see what everybody's buying and selling in the world, okay? And that gives you a lot of power vis-a-vis your adversaries. If you know what their firms, what their businesses are doing in a day-to-day way, then you can anticipate their moves and what you need to do to disrupt them. The second point that we make is called a choke point effect. And this is where states limit access to those central nodes in the economy for their adversaries. And this is the bridge that goes from Colombia to Venezuela. So it's a physical choke point, in the world, but often these are business choke points that we're talking about. They are things like the SWIFT system when the European Union, it disconnected Iranian banks from the SWIFT system as part of the pressure to get Iran to give up its nuclear weapons. It was basically saying there's a global network. Everybody depends on it, and your banks can't have access to it. And it's to coerce Iran into doing some action. Okay, I want to just quickly run through one example of this process. I'm going to use the internet because I like to geek out about the internet. But does anybody know what this building is? It's a data center. Does anybody know where it might be in the world? It's in Northern Virginia, okay? It's about 30 minutes from Dulles Airport in a really like a small town, and it's where Amazon has its data center hub. And a majority of the global traffic in the world goes through these buildings, okay? And so it's one of those things where we think of the internet as complex. It's the web. It's so decentralized. It's Thomas Friedman, blah, blah, blah. But actually, the data has to be stored somewhere. And the way we do cloud services now is that it has to be stored on servers. And those servers are run basically by either Microsoft or Amazon. They're the two global players in that market, unless you're in China. And a lot of those physical infrastructures are concentrated in a few places in the world. And so the story also relies on the fact that the platform companies, the companies that do all your business, they're also concentrated. There's about 5 of them that you all rely on them, I imagine, whether it's Google or Facebook or Apple. And those companies also have a tremendous amount of information about what you do. And so this all becomes very apparent in the Edward Snowden revelations. He was a contractor that worked for the NSA, and in 2013, he releases a set of slides that the NSA had been using after 9/11 in order to show what the NSA's programs were. And I just want to quickly show is like, this is the kind of panopticon effect at work, is that the NSA basically says, we are going to ask a limited number of companies to get access to your data. And we all of a sudden, the NSA, have a window basically into what our adversaries are doing in the world. There was a second program, it was called Storm Brew. It was about the fiber optic cables that run transatlantically across the oceans. Does anybody know what is the speed? This is another one of those geeky things. What is the speed by which data moves on a fiber optic cable? The speed of light. Okay, it's like you're in a Star Trek movie. Prepare for warp speed. What is so crazy about that is that it means it's instantaneous. If it moves at the speed of light, it means it's instantaneous. And so what does that mean? Many countries, like Brazil, they don't have a national fiber optic cable network. And so their data, if you're calling one city in Brazil to another, it's routed through Miami because that's where the fiber optic cables go. And so all of the data of the world, because the US was one of the first movers in fiber optic cables, is being routed through the US system. And so what does the NSA do? It puts taps on where those cables enter the US territory. And whoever at the NSA loved skiing, you can see they were all about these, ski resorts. I don't know, it doesn't have anything to do with the fiber optic cables, but it was a whole other system by which the NSA was able to activate this panopticon. And if anybody thinks that this isn't still happening, you only have to look at the leaks that have been happening over the last 2 weeks to know that the US intelligence system relies on private actor data that is flowing through the world that it can tap into and then gleans knowledge and also benefits from on the battlefield. Okay, these actions are not done. And increasingly, it's not just the panopticon that's being used, but it's also the choke point where the United States, the European Union, China are saying, we're not just going to monitor these networks, but we're going to limit your access to them. The recent export controls that the United States has placed on U.S. technology to China are a great example of this, where they're basically saying you cannot have any access to the next wave of most advanced semiconductors because we're worried about your advances in the world economy. I'm going to talk a little bit more, but I think it's important to flag well, I'll save it. I don't want to spill the beans too much. Okay. So now I want to move to the second part of the talk, which is the warning, which is I want to gin up a little bit of fear. I want you to be motivated that this is something that we really need to talk about, and we need to figure it out, and we need to figure it out pretty fast. I think global warming is a more important issue than this, but after global warming, I think this is probably the most important issue that we're dealing with, because it's about, can we have a global economy anymore? And there are signs right now that we might not be able to do that, and we will all lose if that happens. Okay, so the first is that just European firms are in the crosshairs of this battle. I put up this sign, Ericsson and Huawei, and what happened in Sweden. And everybody's like, okay, is this going to be like Borgen, or what's it going to talk about here? So basically, The Swedish government bans Huawei, the Chinese telecommunications firm, from the Swedish market. And Ericsson, it's its main competitor, okay? This is all about 5G systems, the next generation of the internet. It's actually happening, the same debate is happening in Germany right now. But the thing that's interesting about this case is that Ericsson, in a set of leaked texts, is lobbying the Swedish government not to ban Huawei from the Swedish market. And that, like, from the first year, like, what? Don't they want to get rid of their competitor from the Swedish market? You know, the Ericsson, because Ericsson knows that there are a few more people in China that might want to buy their product than in Sweden. Okay, and for them, it's an existential threat that if they are all of a sudden in the sights of the Chinese government, that they might not be doing so well. And this is the same reason why the German car industry lobbies the German government not to ban Huawei in 2020, because they're also worried. What does the car industry care about the next generation of the internet? They're worried that their market will get squeezed. It's the same reason why today, if you go to the news almost any day, you'll see BASF or Volkswagen saying we need to be very worried about what our China policy is, because the threat is that it's not just states, dealing with stuff. It's about that the global economy is now a weapon, and any business in Europe could be the next victim. Okay. Now, I'm really going to push the nail here a little bit, because I want to say that it's not just about these companies. It's about you. It's about our daily lives. This is a headline from Handelsblatt, which is basically, if the German government bans Huawei from the 5G system, Deutsche Telekom will have to pull out billions of dollars worth of technology that they've already invested in. And who's going to pay for that? You're going to pay for that, okay? Because Deutsche Telekom's not going to suck that up. The energy crisis, it's another example of where these global economic networks have been turned into a weapon, and it's not over. Russia's not going to turn the gas on now. This isn't a crisis that's done. I mean, it is turning to spring, maybe. I don't know. I'm hoping for like a little bit of spring sometime. But either way, the energy bill problem that we faced in this current winter will reoccur. And I think that there's even potentially bigger challenges if you start to get into tit-for-tat actions, where you've already seen the Chinese say, well, we might limit the export of renewable energy technologies to Europe. And it's not that Europe couldn't build those technologies, but they can't build them fast enough to do it before the climate destroys the planet. Or we destroy the planet through the climate, I guess is a better way to say it. Okay, so I think that there are many reasons why we should all be focused on this problem. And I'll just throw a little bit more fire on the fire by saying, that at least when we look to history, it's not just that countries respond by building their own networks or by saying, well, we're going to limit your economic access too. There can also be unanticipated consequences and escalation. This is a great book that I recommend, The Economic Weapon, which looks at pre-World War II economic sanctions and the consequences that they had. And one of the findings that this historian makes is to say that Europe's, the British and French and U.S. economic sanctions were part of the drivers of German revanchism, and that they escalated kind of the military exercises that Germany undertook. And so for all of these reasons, I think that we need to get a handle on this soon. And Europe is not just a spectator. I think a lot of times when I have these conversations in Europe, people say, well, that's just the U.S. and China are doing this. But why did I put up the euro in this picture is because the European Central Bank literally evaporated $300 billion worth of Russian central bank reserves in a weekend. Well, that is a very provocative act if you're Beijing, because you own a lot of central bank reserves that are in euro denominations as well. And so if Europe can do this to Russia, why couldn't they do it to China? These kinds of actions, it's often we think of we're doing good, which I think in this case, it was a good action, the Russia sanctions campaign. But we have to also recognize what third parties, how they might interpret it. And this action cannot be interpreted just as a nice thing to, help people out. It's also a symbol of European power and what European power can do. Okay, so here's the hope. We're in the third act, so I hope you stick with me, is that I think that there needs to be a set of actions, both in Germany and at the European Union, that comes to grapple with this set of issues. And this is a lot of what I've been doing my research on while I've been at the Academy. So the first point is just building the expertise. Henry and I, we had a piece on the, I guess that's your right, it was in Nature, where we just go through the limits that governments, but I think especially in Europe, have of understanding how complicated the networks are that make up the global economy. The number of people that are devoted, for example, to semiconductors in the German bureaucracy, it's not very big, okay? And it's a very essential sector for understanding the future of these issues. Similarly, at the European Union level, it's a handful of people. And even in the United States, where we have quite a lot of people thinking about this, we do not have the understanding of like the third tier of the supply chain, even if we know the first tier of what's going on. So it's just a learning issue. It's an issue about expertise. And there, it's important to understand the difference in the type of vulnerabilities that these networks create. And so on one side here, the little piles of dirt are the rare earth minerals. Everybody loves the rare earth minerals. And the rare earth minerals are very important. But the funny thing about the rare earth minerals is that they're not that rare, the rare earth minerals. They're just gross. Okay, they're really gross to make, and people die when they make them, and they're very hard on the workers. And so we've outsourced this problem to other countries, mostly China. And so this is a hard issue. China could use this as an economic weapon, but ultimately the West or the US and Europe could deal with this because it would just be an issue of we would have to figure out the safety issues of how to substitute this product. This is a traditional economics problem of there needs to be a substitute for a good. The other side is more about my world of these networks, because you have an issue where the EU and the UK, they put sanctions on Russian supertankers to stop them from transporting oil. And how do they do that? Because the EU and the UK corner the market on the insurance companies that provide insurance to those supertankers. There aren't really other substitutes for that. And so you would have to create a whole new network of financial firms in order to get around that type of power. And so it's really important when you're thinking about the risks of globalization. Some risks, rare earth metals, are a nuisance, but they're solvable. Others are not. And you really need to figure out where are you in that world in order to address it as a policymaker. Okay, next question. Where am I in the world? Hamburg. And as most Germans, I don't know, maybe like geeky Germans like me who are following this, there are different types of threats. This is about the Hamburger Hafen. There was a sale, investment of a Chinese company into this port. And a lot of people were worried about the choke point. Would China shut down this port if there was ever a war? And for me, that's a red herring. That is not the issue about this. What's the issue with this is that China has invested in all of the major European ports, Antwerp, Rotterdam, Greece. They have invested in all these places, and they, as a minority shareholder, are going to get data on what is happening in these terminals, the information about the business activity of these ports. And for me, the issue is the panopticon. It's the concern that the information about the global economy will be funneled from the ports to Costco, and Costco is the Chinese company, to the Chinese government, because it's a state-owned enterprise. So you can't think that there's much division between these things. Now, it could be that this decision gets reversed. There's a kind of a controversy in the government right now, which I can talk about at length later. But it's important to know what is the type of threat you're facing in order to address it as a policymaker. The next point I just want to make is that in many places, Europe doesn't have the toolkit, or is only starting to have the toolkit to create a response. And here I give two examples. The top is about European privacy laws. And what do European privacy laws do? They say they don't just apply to Europe, they apply to the world. And that's something that could be used not just in economic issues, but also in these strategic areas, is to say the internal market is Europe's best defense against some of these problems. But it would require that the European Union view these economic issues. Uh-oh, somebody's saying hello. I love kids too. I love kids. I have a very cute kid. That's what I call it. The second point I want to make is the anti-coercion instrument. It's still going on. It's somebody's hacked into my life. The second point is something that just happened a few weeks ago, which is called the anti-coercion instrument. It's a tool where the European Union can use its trade mechanism in order to defend Europe against this type of coercion. But if either of these things are going to work in this new world of economic coercion, they have to be credible. And that means you have to show that you would use them if push came to shove. And what I put up here is OFAC is the sanctioning authority in the United States, and I put up BNP Paribas, it's a Belgian bank, because in 2010, French bank, yikes. Oh my God, I'm in trouble. The United States went after a series of banks and smacked them with really big fines. And what it did was it was showing that it was willing to use these tools to make a difference. And what I'm worried about the European Union right now is when they released the anti-coercion instrument, in the kind of release, it was like, we'll never use these tools. We do not ever want to use them. Well, that's not a credible threat. That is not going to keep China or the United States from doing something that Europe doesn't want. Because you have to show, in order to be a deterrent, you have to prove that you would be willing to use it. And that's where I come with these tools. They're just that. They're just tools. They're just a weapon. They're not a strategy. They do not have an objective. They're just a way to coerce your adversary. They don't tell you why you would do it, when you would do it, what for you would do it. And that's why I think the European Union, President von der Leyen of the EU Commission, she's announced she's going to put together an economic security agenda. And I think it's really important because it has to lay out what would we use these things for, when, and when would we not use them. Because that's when you have both a deterrent, but you also prevent that unanticipated spiral from happening. The thing I was talking about in the warning, the thing that would stop the escalation from getting out of control. And so I think, we're here right now at the precipice, almost like we were in 1945 when nuclear weapons were put on the scene. It's a period where there's a new weapon, but we don't really know what are the rules about it. Policymakers, they had to come up with the idea of mutually assured destruction. Nuclear weapons didn't come with a rule book. And so that's why I think something like the economic security plan could come up with a set of arguments, a set of reasons about when should we and when should we not engage in this type of activity in order to have a sensible way to contain the fallout. The last thing that I want to just argue is that, as I said, these are just sticks. They're weapons. They're ways to coerce your adversary. And in order to have a world that we want to live in, we have to have a set of carrots to make that happen. So these tools, they've been used for things like non-proliferation, terrorism, the Russia conflict. But you could imagine they would also be used for climate, to increase sustainability in our world. And you already see Europe doing that with the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And so that's fine. I think that's a good idea because I think we need as much action as possible on climate. But you have to couple that with carrots, with funding for those third parties in the rest of the world. Otherwise, they're just going to see you as an imperial power trying to push your weight around in the world. Okay, so where does that leave us? I think a few key points. The first is that these economic networks, they're not just the myth of prosperity and, happy, happy, joy, joy. They're also a site of control and of power, and we have to see them as that. We need to think about how can we use them in a strategic way, not just addressing the next crisis. These things got started after 9/11 when the US government was basically scrambling for some kind of response to the terrorist attack in September 11th. And then they got used again against North Korea, then against Iran, then they get put in place against Russia. It's not been done with any kind of systematic plan, but really about kind of a whack-a-mole project. And my concern is if we don't have a strategic understanding of that, it could escalate out of control, where a large part of the global economy becomes threatened. A lot of what I've talked about, the spider in the web, that's not the whole economy. There's plenty of places where you can have cooperative economic activity and not have this type of threat. And so it's really important to put them in different boxes and say, where do we think there's a gray area or a black area where we're really concerned? And what's all of the good stuff that we can keep going? Because that's how we'll have the best outcome, where we get to continue to enjoy all the fruits or a lot of the fruits of globalization without sacrificing the whole kit and caboodle. So with that, I'll end with a thank you. And also, Cornelia is going to get the pre-print of the book, which is up here, which doesn't even have an index. But I encourage everybody to take a look on Amazon, preordernow.com. Feed the centralization of the Amazon network so that the U.S. can use it as powerful as it can. Okay, thank you.
I think very convincing argument, at least maybe you're preaching to the converted, but I am both, I have rid myself of the myth. I feel fully warned. I'm not hopeful yet, so I'm hoping that maybe in the discussion we can make sure we leave here with enough confidence that this is a challenge we can manage. I have the privilege to ask you questions if the room isn't already raising hands, but I always like to open the room quite quickly. So maybe let me just start with one quick question to get you talking a little bit, and so that everybody can think of the questions they would like to ask you. I would like you to expand a little bit more on the hope part, and in particular on your recommendations for Europe, because I have followed the tools you see and that the Commission is working on to have an anti-coercive instrument. Here we just see that they're responding defensively to something, but I do not see how that would work, not just to make it credible, that's one thing on one of the tools, but even just to agree on an objective, to agree on how to put that in place with different tools behind it, simply because of all the things we know about the European Union, 27 member states, difficult decision making, what exactly is our strategic objective and who do we trust. So I see just a wealth of problems that I can talk about at length, but I'd like to hear you first and then open the room. So what should we hope the European Union gets together to respond to this?
Great. So I don't want to underestimate the challenge, because as the myth part of the talk suggests, there is a deeply ingrained set of beliefs that Europe is about openness and liberalization, and that's kind of what made Europe work, and it did work for a long time, and so we shouldn't discount that. That being said, I think there is something quite remarkable happening in Brussels right now, which we should all pay attention to, and I do think it's something new. And what that is that for several years there's been a conversation about a geopolitical commission. So President von der Leyen, she started that off when she was elected, and I would say it was like a grab bag of ambiguity. People were like, I have no idea what this means, how is it going to happen? And it was maybe seen as a warmed over version of the external policy of the European Union, which has, I think, in many ways been largely a failure. Okay, so you can call it many different things, CSDP, ESDP. There's it's like almost a Monty Python gig. But the long, the short of it is that she started a conversation saying that the European Union is going to start thinking about these geopolitical issues. And what has happened in the intervening years is that economic issues have become geopolitical issues. And why is that important? Because the Commission and the European Union is based on getting things done in economic areas. And it's where the European Union has the most power. And so what you see happening right now is that those elements of the European Union, that basically DG Trade and DG Internal Market, that those pieces of the Commission are the ones that are now spearheading this economic security conversation. And so you can kind of see that as like it could go either way, because those institutions, they could basically, they could use bureaucratic turf wars to kill that because it's contra their traditional mandate. Or you could see it as they're the most powerful, the most organized, and the most capable sets of the European Union to carry out this agenda. And my feeling right now is hopeful that that's what's going to happen.
Let me see if somebody in the room would also already like to come in. Can you please, I'll take you because we're quickest, also present yourself and then ask a question. Yes, you.
Melissa Eddy's my name. I'm from the New York Times, but I'm obviously just here. Hi, Abe. You mentioned China and Hamburg, Costco and Hamburg, which is going to be discussed in cabinet tomorrow, and said you could say a lot on it. And I would love to hear what you have to say about it in terms of one thing I just would also specifically is it took the BSI. So it was, it seemed that the information security community was far more concerned about this than the economic policy community. Is that true? And if so, what do you make of that? And how do you see this playing out?
So I see it as kind of raw politics. So I think the original, the way I understand it, was that all of the cabinet ministries were lined up saying they were not in support of this deal, including SPD ministries and Green ministries and FDP ministries. It was across the board. They had done their internal analyses and they'd come to the conclusion, in addition to the security agencies. And then the chancellor basically said, no, you got to go back and make this deal happen. And my sense is that he's from Hamburg, and he has a set of political interests there that he needs to cultivate, and so he decided to go through with the deal. I think what's happening right now is so crazy in my mind because it seems to me, as I understand it, there was a bureaucratic snafu in the economics ministry that about where this case fell in a certain bureaucratic definition of critical infrastructure, and there was a revisiting of that, or there was a finding out that hadn't been taken into account. It's reopened the bag, and now the security agencies are pushing to get it overturned. And I think what'll happen is we'll just have to wait and see. It's so exciting for somebody like me who studies these issues. But either way, I think for me, it's a great example of kind of how domestic politics gets in the way of managing these global, issues, because it's a situation where everybody says, well, why don't you just deal with all this economic coercion? You should just be able to solve this. And you're like, well, it's actually quite complicated because there's domestic interests involved and they don't always swim in the same direction.
And that's just one city in one country in the European Union. Yeah. So I'm not yet quite hopeful. I have another hand. I have three hands. Maybe we can collect by two, and then I'll work my way. I see we start in the row in the front, and then move our way to the back, or the other way around. Whoever grabs the mic.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. My name is Julian Ringhoff. I'm a policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, where I work on how technology development shapes international affairs and the other way around. So maybe if you allow me one quick comment and one short question. So first on the, I guess, institutional challenge that you already alluded to with regards to as trade policy and security policy increasingly merges and what that means for the European Union. I think it's true that in some policy areas or some policy tools where the European Commission is somewhat the driving force, I'm also optimistic, but we're currently looking together with my colleague Tobias next to me at export controls, where of course, even though it's part of the common commercial policy, the way the regulation is set up, the competency for implementing these controls rests largely in member states. And we just had a discussion on this with member states before coming here. And even though there's some awareness that, let's say, greater alignment would probably be in the union's interest, member states are extremely reluctant to delegate more competency towards the European Commission in that. And so we're really pessimistic with regards to the European Union being able of using export controls in a common European interest. So maybe that's the comment. And then the question is, you said that and I agree with that you see a centralization of production, the hub and spoke metaphor that you used. And I think, of course, this is true, and it's particularly true for digital technologies. But I would say that for especially very complex hardware, that you see something, maybe you can call it decentralized centralization, because you mentioned semiconductors. And of course, it's true that above 90% of the production of advanced semiconductors happens in Taiwan. But it's also true that there's, across the entire supply chain, which is extremely long and extremely complex, you have not just one centralization, but you have hundreds of centralizations, because investment is so high, and I guess because transaction costs are so low, you do see for one product not one centralization, but you basically see hundreds of centralizations where just one company makes each subcomponent. And yeah, I would just be curious how you think about that, because it's not just a centralization, but it's basically a dispersed centralization.
Yes.
May I add a second question? Because I see the questions are getting longer, and my list is as well. So just to the front, and then you can answer in pairs of two.
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
please.
Rekin Kaivo, happen to be a business lawyer and banking lawyer, commercial real estate financing, come from the international public law field. I wonder as to whether or not it could really deter the topic when we look at the leverage that we're trying to impose, because only short comment, but the leverage that the Americans happen to be requiring with regard to deterring China, for instance, engaging into whatever conflict scenario there may be part of it. But then the technical field would only be regarded in terms of safeguarding our backyard, to put it that way, because we happen to be allies, of course. So the major impetus that I'm trying to focus on is to whether or not these moves that you're commenting on and describing very accurately and very importantly, finally, given the past in Germany and Europe at least, could deter an aggressor eventually of decoupling. Because this is a scenario that we have, or at least the Americans, I think, have to be focusing realistically, forward-looking, as to whether or not at a certain point of time we may face a Hamilton moment and China may simply ask for occupying the Moluccan Straits, for instance. And what do you do with data once you happen to focus and deter millions of soldiers in a strategically important and vital region of the world? That's my question. Thank you.
Abe, floor is yours.
Uh-oh. Oh, is this back in the sad face? No, I am not going to be in the sad face. So the first thing I would say about the point that Julia, was it Julia? Yeah, made about that we need to understand the different points of control across the supply chain. And this is a really important point, and it's my call to basically we need more expertise to understand these supply chains. What you need to have is you need to have a government that understands that complexity and then also has the institutions to leverage that, to use it. And so one of the things that I think is really fascinating in the semiconductor space is that everybody talks about TSMC, that it's this company, it's the only one that can make these very high, or whatever. But what did the US do is that the US controls a very important segment of the semiconductor supply chain, which are these EDA softwares. It's like the software that you need to make the semiconductors. So it's only basically 3 companies in the world make it. There are 2 Americans and a German company bought an American company, but they're all through US export controls. And the US got those classified under, there's this thing, the Wassenaar Agreement. It's too nerdy for most people, but it's the thing that regulates export controls. The US got those things classified as one of these things that can be regulated through export controls. So what did it do? It used basically intellectual property that the American government or American companies produce to put a control on TSMC, to say, TSMC, you can't sell things to China. And so that's just an example where you have to understand the complexity of the supply chain and where the centralization is and which countries can leverage that in order to understand how these tools can be used. It's not just a simple story as big company equals danger. It's about the different elements of that. So I think it's a really important point. The second point about export controls in the EU, I think I'm of two sides of this. I think one of the things that's important to note is that different jurisdictions will use different tools about how they engage in this struggle. So the US government right now is relying on export controls in order to strangle the Chinese tech sector. Now, does that mean Europe should rely on export controls to do that? It's probably not Europe's best strategy. I don't think, as you point out, Europe doesn't have a comparative advantage in that institutional sector. It's not something that even the member states are very good at doing. So it's not something that I would put my hope in. Now, the EU is very good at conditioning market access to its economy through the single market, and it has done that for decades through a lot of different places. So that's something that the U.S. is actually more reluctant to do. The U.S. hasn't done that much. And so you just have to see, what's your institutional added value, and where could you get your objective? So I think there's an array of tools in the toolkit, and not every state will use the same ones. And so we should really focus about what's a European economic security strategy. The final question, which is about U.S.-China decoupling, and I think that this is like my big plea, which is we need a language to talk about this world that isn't just decoupling, because in many of these settings, the solution is actually, I don't know if it's kind of a corny, it's a recoupling. It's about not creating separate camps, but it's about diversifying the risk. You don't want to be reliant on one company that can then create these choke points. And so sometimes you might have to do things that are inefficient in the Ricardian world. You might have to have industrial policy where you spur on companies, even though there's a global company that provides that at a cheaper price, because you're concerned that you'll be too dependent on a foreign government. And I would just take the case of the telecommunications sector. For decades, governments thought the telecommunications sector was a critical sector. It was run by the governments. There were things called PTTs. The Deutsche Telekom exists because it was the PTT for a long time. And then there was a bunch of economists in Chicago who said, you should just privatize all those things. It'll be more efficient. Yeah, but it's a critical infrastructure, and all of a sudden, some foreign country is in control of your telecommunication system. Twitter is in charge of your public sphere. I mean, for me, that's just yes, it's more efficient maybe, but it's just not safer. And so at some point, you have to say, we're in a new world where vulnerabilities have to be traded off against efficiency, and sometimes that means you have to you have to waste some money to increase your security. And for me, that's not just decoupling, it's about diversification as a strategy.
So I have four more people on the list. I have at least 6 people here online. We'll go by pairs, but questions crisp and short. And the next one was either Michael Berger or behind. I don't know whose hand was up. Behind then. It's somewhere up here. There was a group of 3 hands, and then I have one over here. I have one in the front, and then one again in the back. Maybe we go by groups of 3. Short question, please.
Is it me?
Yes.
Hi. Thank you. Tobias Gerke, also from the European Council on Foreign Relations. A fantastic talk, as always. Just to say that your work and Henry's had a huge impact also on my work. When you came out in 2019 with this work, I was sort of in the midst of my PhD, and that sort of got me through, I think. So it's really great. I had 2 questions, but a lot of questions on the table, so I'm going to stick to one. On the last one, on your ideas on this strategy. You said we're in the same line of business, so of course we also think that should be necessary. But I'm wondering, yes. You sort of said it should sort of line out where when to take action, when not to take action. Sort of set a clear trigger of when Europe should be able to weaponize, for instance, its interdependencies. But wouldn't that also take away your leverage? If you clearly set out what you're going to do, under what circumstances, wouldn't others then be able to exploit that quite easily? Arguably, the reason why US sanctions and export controls are so powerful, because they can be used quite easily, and it's not quite clear when they're going to be taken away against companies. So the compliance is high, because it's not quite clear when, how they're going to be used and how they're going to be taken away again. And so if you set out in a strategy exactly what you're going to do, only when you hit this trigger will I use a sanction, for example.
you could sort of maybe argue you don't have any leverage at all. You have to be kind of in a gray zone of when you're going to leverage your interdependence to be able to have some power. What do you make of that argument? Does that collide with the sort of strategy of setting it out, or do you think that is still necessary? Thanks.
Okay, hold your answer.
Don't,
And I'll move over to Amika Lotari. I'm managing.
Yes, you're amazing.
Thank you also for a fantastic speech. My name is Miko Tari. I'm the Executive Director of Merix. And I have to ask a question about China, at least implicitly. You've been quite optimist, I think, at the outset. I am, as a person. But on this issue, I'm skeptical for two reasons. One is you seem to imply, at least, which I want to test you a bit on, that this is all going to work out if we just behave responsibly in designing our own tools. Well, there's China, right? We don't expect China to behave responsibly in terms of economic coercion and other aspects. So, and then there's these other layers of the China story, which is about deep military competition, systemic competition, and all. So, you didn't say a word about these issues really, and I wonder how your largely economic picture features in that. Then, if you had one recommendation for the economic security strategy that the European Commission will put out in June, what is it? So, and I give you 4 layers that you could look at. How offensive, how defensive does it need to be? How institutionalized or how loose can it be? How multilateral does it have to be, or basically unilateral? And how, that's the most important one, how country agnostic or specific does it need to be? Thank you.
Okay, I think those are dense questions, so I'll give you the floor back now, and then we'll go around the room.
Okay, so I think to Tobias's point, they're related, but they're different. And so the point is that you need to make your coercion credible. You have to be willing to use it. You need to be able to show other people that they should be worried. And these sanctions, they often work through compliance chains in companies, legal departments who are freaking out, who are worried if we don't comply. And so you get over-compliance. You want over-compliance because you want the companies to basically to be your foot soldiers and do the enforcement for you. But you should articulate a set of use cases of where you think it's safe to use these tools and where you don't think it's safe to use these tools, or under what condition. And for me, one of the most provocative things that the United States has done is that it has basically, I would say, tried to destroy Huawei as a provider of 5G systems and mobile phones. And that is, in my mind, you're targeting another great powers hub. China has this idea that they'll provide 5G systems, and so we're going to try to degrade that hub. And if you just go back to like nuclear strategy, it's like a first strike kind of action, and that's very aggressive. And so what I'm saying is if you're going to have these tools, you should be willing to use them, but you should have a set of parameters about where you will and won't use them in order to prevent escalation. And I think you could have accomplished the same goal, which is limit Huawei's entry into certain markets through carrots instead of sticks. So why wasn't there you could call it EU, US, NATO, whoever it was, 5G purchasing program of Ericsson and Nokia products. Ericsson and Nokia make the same products, so we should have had industrial policy that says, let's diversify our system, and we'll do that. The Chinese do that all the time, intervene in their market in order to get the outcome that they want. They wouldn't have seen that as the same type of, aggressive action. So I think what I'm trying to say is that you need a set of ground rules of like, where do you think escalation could happen and where wouldn't you? And you should lay those out so that people can anticipate those in order to get best activities. And then where you say you're going to use these tools, you have to be willing to use them because otherwise they're meaningless. I don't know, Mika, you had a lot of points here. I think the first point is that the rules-based system did not work well with China because we had this idea that everybody was just neutral players and that economic markets were not about power, that economic markets were about efficiency. And China was playing a different set of games. So we can say they weren't responsible actors, but it was like they were playing the old game of like, well, we can do whatever we want if we have an outcome that we want. So now everybody's in that game, and everybody is trying to figure out how do we get, so then we have to say, well, what should the objective be? And for me, what should be first on the economic security strategy? It should be, what's the priority? What are we trying to accomplish? So there's all these things about like the institutions, the offensive defense. It should be, what is the purpose of an economic security strategy? And for me, it's about a sustainable, inclusive, secure Europe. That should what it be. Other people will have a different thing. But it should lay out at the very top level, these are the challenges that our economic tools should be put to bear in order to accomplish. And if you get in the way of that, then we will use these tools in order to do that. So that you can put CBAM is under this strategy because it's an important pillar of getting to the sustainability portion of that set of goals. Then I think, you have to go through your points. I don't think that one is more than the other, but right now, I don't think Europe has any of these things. A definition of whether it's defensive or offensive. It doesn't have a clear definition of what are the institutions that it has. This will be uncomfortable for Europe, but it is definitely a set of unilateral tools. It can be done plurilaterally in cooperation with other countries, but this is not like anybody who tells you like, well, we're going to talk about this at the WTO. That's just forget about it. That's not what this is about. This game is like beyond the WTO. It doesn't mean the WTO can't still do things. It still does a lot of important things. It keeps tariffs low. We all enjoy the benefits of the WTO system, but it can't solve, or we're not going to use export controls through the WTO, or, it's like that's total anathema to them.
Let me move through the room and also throw in some questions from online, but you're up next, and then I'll read some, and then I have in the back of the room as well.
Okay, thank you.
Mike is coming.
Thank you very much. My name is Christian Kalis. I'm professor at Free University for European Law. My question would be, where do you see the difference between weaponized interdependence and economic diplomacy? I mean, this is a notion, I think, that they're closely related. I think there is some overlap, isn't it? I am not sure. Maybe you can explain this a little bit more.
Hold your answer. I'll add two questions. I have one from what I think is Myra Davies online, who asks about global finance, and in particular the instruments of financial capitalism. You've talked a lot about data networks and the internet, but how much of our vulnerabilities, dependencies really are the financial networks, and does that change how we can act on them? Is the first question. The second question from Samuel Newbold is about individual behavior to try and avoid the very highly centralized system. So how much of a difference does it make if I boycott Amazon and I go buy my books through another online sales offer, or how much does it change if we don't use Amazon Web Services but other types of platforms? Is there a citizen resistance boycott to these very strongly centralized networks, and what do you think about it? And then maybe, because I'm collecting, can I also get... No, okay. Too much on your plate. Public wants you to answer.
Thanks, Lori. Lori's face right now. She's like, oh, God, how are you going to do this? So economic diplomacy is, I think, I'm not sure, it can mean a lot of different things. So what I think of a lot of times is commercial diplomacy, and it's a little bit... There is a world where what we were worried about was that our companies, like Western companies, would go into a developing country and that those governments would treat those companies poorly, and that we, Western countries, would need to intervene to protect our companies in those countries, okay? It was a lot about like property rights and what we call commercial diplomacy, of intervening with a foreign government that was going to nationalize an oil company or something like that. And that, what Henry and I are trying to say is that the threat isn't the destination. It's not where you land in globalization. It's actually the way you get there. The channel of globalization is what's exposing you to risk. And so we need to rethink what is political risk and where do governments need to conduct this type of intervention. It might not be in the host country of something, but it's actually in the networks. And so it's kind of, that I think is the way I would respond to that. Global finance plays a huge part of the book, which is on pre-order. No, so basically, there's something called the dollar clearing system, which is if you are going to buy or sell almost anything in the world, you're going to go through a set of U.S. banks to do it. And it's a very complicated structure that I could spend the entire 2 minutes we have left of the session.
We have time.
10. Well, I'm not going to see it. I can spend it. But basically, there's just a few U.S. banks that are the back end infrastructure of how the global trading system works. And I do not think you are going to be able to replace that system. A lot of people have kind of said, well, will China, the renminbi, will it replace the dollar in response to the things that Henry and I have described? Like, will it come up with its own hubs? And I think it's a really difficult challenge for China to do that because it has its own domestic political concerns that are in conflict with that effort. So one of them, I'll give you an example, was something called Ant Financial. It was basically going to be PayPal from China, and it was run by a guy named Jack Ma, who was going to be an oligarch. He was going to be a very rich, economically powerful person. And the Chinese government basically just dismantled that company, even though it could have been a challenge to the US-based payment system, because that person was going to be a domestic political threat to the regime, okay? So that's like an example where, just like the Hamburger Hafen example, where domestic politics gets in the way of countries doing things that maybe seem rational at the global level. That doesn't mean I don't think that China or other countries will try to respond to these economic threats that the dollar system faces, but I think what's more likely is you'll get dark spaces in the global economy where people will just try to do transactions, deals that are less efficient, less transparent, and eat harder for the US or other countries to regulate. And you saw that with Iran. That's what they've done, is they've done a bunch of basically like these complex shell companies. They get the trade done. They pay for it. It's not efficient, but it allows them to continue to trade even under a really oppressive sanctions regime. A citizen's resistance. So I've been watching Occupied. I don't know if any people, it's this Norway is being a soft occupation by Russia. Is there a citizen resistance? So what I think is interesting, and it's a research agenda that I'm kind of thinking about right now, is when do these nodal hubs degrade? When do they stop being hubs? And I'm kind of like, I'm interested in like Twitter, what's happening with Twitter right now. Because it was a very vibrant community that was very, like people would say it would never go away. It was like so powerful. But it is, I think, in some ways degrading right now. And whether it will totally go away or just kind of limp along, but I think that is a bottom up, all of the things I describe of the economic networks, they're not mostly state created. They're mostly private actor. We create them by using them. And so, yes, we can degrade them, but it's not easy. You need something that is really focusing the collective action of the users to say, this thing doesn't solve my problem anymore. And I think Twitter is something that we really need to study it for that example.
But let me throw in, we can think bigger than Twitter, by looking at Google and what's happening since ChatGPT-3 can answer questions without the advertisements. So even things that we thought would never go away, I think can be challenged, but not through the individual, I'll go somewhere else. I think it is more of a real market structure.
Could be that too.
But interesting point. Let me give you the floor in the back of the room.
Okay. Hi, Abe. Catherine Kluver-Ashberg for the Bertelsmann Foundation, but I used to run for 12 years a program on the future of diplomacy, and so you'll forgive me that this last question is precisely around the direction of diplomacy and vertical and horizontal negotiation, because you've mapped a lot of the entry points, and that, of course, assumes that the mapping capacities that you have elucidated, which is the governments, are capable of interacting with businesses in a way that they suddenly have a different kind of hierarchical relationship, that businesses are able and capable of feeding that kind of information back to their capitals or wherever decisions get made. And then there's other, because we've talked about the Hamburg Harbor, the other actors that are looking at node structures are looking at the places where we have vulnerabilities. Those are increasingly our cities, our regions, things that we've put in the front line in the service of our global economy, but haven't figured out how to get diplomatic and economic intelligence back from them. So I wonder if in this last question you can kind of map how you see this sort of multi-directional relationship between these different actors that now become parts of negotiating, how we either unspin the node or make the node more useful. What would you want there? It's no longer through lobbying organizations or business associations in the way that you can make those strategic decisions. So who talks to whom when in this way of resorting the web?
Let me see if somebody wants to get in a last question. This is your opportunity. One more in the back, and then we will give you the final words of wisdom before we close at noon.
Hi, I'm Nicholas. This is David. We're from the Hertie School, in fact. We're master students. And we attended the Hannover Messe last week, and we talked to Festo, a German automation company. And what was surprising was about 35% of the revenue stems from China. And so my question is, what advice would you give to the CEO to protect the revenue? Because if let's say, an economic warfare breaks out, that means thousands of people might lose their jobs. So, what would your advice be in that regard?
Great. Okay. So I think it's such like an infant stage in understanding this problem and the data that companies have that could be helpful and the capacity of governments to absorb that information. And so I think there's so much low-hanging fruit in that place, because I think for many of the places where censoring is happening, like trying to sense what's happening in this global economy, there's almost no communication back up or down. And so if a government was more thoughtful about it, I think they could get a lot more information. I think it is very important that they think about the sectors and the experts in the sectors, and not like these global efforts. It's like narrow down what you think might be strategic in your toolkit, and then do some deep dives into those things. The German government, the US government, they've done that on these critical minerals. It's a kind of an easy first case, use case. And so I think that's good. But as I said in the talk, I think that's like a less of a danger as some of the other things. Europe and Germany have passed these public procurement laws, which basically require companies to report intricate amount of information about their supply chains. It was created to target human rights issues in supply chains, but you could definitely use that law to get at these types of issues. You could force companies to report single source supplying of different inputs into their supply chains. We don't, because that's like, well, why do we want to do that? Because economic and security issues are merging, and so we have to think about those things. The U.S. has a new set of regulations that force semiconductor firms to give information about their supply chains to the U.S. government. All of those things are like new, and we're experimenting, but as I said before, the number of people working in many governments on each of these sectors is so little, and the amount of data that we're asking companies for, even just the first year, is really little. So I think we have a lot of place to grow there. Let me end. Are we ending?
You're good. Take your time.
Yeah, but with this question about the China, what should Germany's China strategy be? And I think that this is a really it's essential to the future of Germany, because I think for decades, Germany had this strategy, which I put up, Wandel durch Handel, which was basically, it was a one-way street where Germany would gain from its relationships with China or Russia or whatever, and there would be no really consequences for Germany except bringing the sweet euros back, And I think that was a sucker's bet. We've seen that in Russia. And we know that also will happen in China. And so Germany has to prepare itself for a world where it's not a one-way street, and that it goes both ways, and it can be a vulnerability as well as a benefit. And that's what the chancellor said after he went, or when he went to China, was that we need a world of interdependence without dependence. And that, I think, is a great slogan. And now we need to put it into action. How do you make that happen? And one of the things I think you have to do is you have to confront those CEOs and ask them, how many German workers depend on those factories in China? Because at least in my mind, those factories are employing Chinese workers, and those are not German workers. So who's benefiting from all of that sweet goodness? It's German investors who've invested in those plants. They're making the profit investment out of those plants. Well, that's important, and that's a debate, and that's a lot of money. But you need to disentangle the Modell Deutschland, where like Germany's are making it and sending it. That's like an old world. Now, BASF or VW, they're making it there. They're employing those Chinese workers. And so how do we think about the vulnerabilities that then are also being created by having that relationship? And what I think is amazing is that for the first time in 30, 50 years, Germany's having that conversation. The chancellery, the foreign ministry, it's not, well, we just got to keep doing Modell Deutschland and Wandel durch Handel. There are groups like BASF and VW that are pushing, no, we should keep doing that. But there's a debate. And so I think it's a really exciting time to think about these topics in Germany. And I don't think there's an answer on the table yet. But I think that's why we all need to focus on this question and say, let's get some answers.
Thank you very much, Abe, for getting us focused on the question. I think it's hugely important. I also would like to stick with the somber introduction you've done. I don't think we have the answers yet, and I think the possibility that you have shown here are great in the good and in the bad sense, because as with all empires, the global networks are open for abuse even for good reasons. I think you've written excellent pieces for those who are interested in foreign affairs about what it might do to play too many of these cards too quickly, in particular because it involves not just governmental relations, but also the companies. You're sending signals there. They create systemic imbalances. They will create reactions. And so I really think we're in for a whole new era of weaponized interdependence. And if you want to read more about it, this is the required reading if you were in my class. But I really hope you got interested through this.
And if anybody knows a German publisher, wink, wink.
Thank you very much, Abe. This was wonderful.
Thank you, Cornelia.